Disclaimer. This video contains intense and frightening content meant for entertainment purposes. It may include scenes that some viewers may find disturbing or unsettling. We recommend viewer discretion, especially for those sensitive to horror themes or with underlying medical conditions that could be affected by intense content. The events portrayed in this video are entirely fictional, and any resemblance to real-life situations or individuals is coincidental. We do not endorse harmful or illegal activities. By continuing to watch, you acknowledge the content warning and proceed at your own discretion.
Story 1: The Watchful Neighbor. I moved into my new apartment with great excitement. It was a charming, historic building in a quiet neighborhood. The rent was reasonable, and it seemed like the perfect place to start my new life. Little did I know that my enthusiasm would soon be replaced with dread, thanks to my creepy neighbor. From the moment I moved in, something felt off. My neighbor, Mr. Jenkins, lived in the apartment next door. He was an elderly man, maybe in his late 70s, with thinning white hair and a perpetually stern expression. I introduced myself, hoping to be friendly, but he only nodded and muttered something unintelligible before closing his door. I brushed off the strange encounter, thinking that maybe he was just an unsocial person. But as the weeks passed, I couldn't ignore the peculiarities any longer. Late at night, I'd hear strange noises coming from his apartment. Whispers, shuffling, and sometimes what sounded like soft cries. At first I assumed he had a visitor or was watching a disturbing movie. But the sounds continued night after night, and I couldn't shake the feeling that something was seriously wrong. One evening, I mustered the courage to knock on his door and inquire about the noises. Mr. Jenkins opened the door just a crack, his eyes darting nervously. I asked if he was okay, and he mumbled something about a family matter and quickly closed the door. The situation only grew stranger. I noticed him standing in the hallway, staring at my door for long periods of time. When I passed him, he'd abruptly turn and walk away, as if he'd been caught doing something he shouldn't. One afternoon, I decided to investigate further. I peered through my peephole, watching as Mr. Jenkins left his apartment. Curiosity got the better of me, and I cautiously entered his unit. What I saw inside sent shivers down my spine. The walls were covered in photographs, hundreds of them. They were all of me, taken from various angles, seemingly without my knowledge. Some were close-ups of my face while I was sleeping or watching TV. Others captured me in the hallway or entering my apartment. It was a meticulous, chilling collection of my life. Panicked, I called the police, and they arrived promptly to investigate. Mr. Jenkins returned while they were there, and he was taken into custody. As they searched his apartment further, they discovered a hidden room behind a bookshelf. Inside, they found a shrine dedicated to me, filled with candles, strange symbols, and handwritten notes that mentioned his obsession with me. The police informed me that Mr. Jenkins had been stalking me for years, documenting my every move. He had no criminal record, which made the situation even more unsettling. They assured me he would be held accountable for his actions. In the weeks that followed, I moved out of that apartment building, unable to shake the feeling of being watched. I couldn't comprehend how someone could become so obsessed with a neighbor, someone they barely knew. It was a terrifying experience that still haunts me to this day. As I settled into my new, secure home, I couldn't help but look over my shoulder, knowing that the memory of my creepy neighbor, Mr. Jenkins, would linger for a long time. The experience taught me to trust my instincts and to always be vigilant of those around me. Creepy neighbors can hide in plain sight, and it's essential to take any signs of danger seriously, no matter how subtle they may seem.
Story 2: The Serial Killer. Next door. It all began innocently enough when I moved into my new apartment in a small, peaceful town. I was a young man in my mid-20s, eager to start fresh in a place far removed from the bustling city. The apartment building was old but charming, nestled among tall trees and surrounded by a lush, overgrown garden. My first encounter with my neighbor, Mr. Matheson, seemed perfectly ordinary. He appeared to be a friendly man in his early 50s, with salt and pepper hair and a warm smile. He welcomed me to the neighborhood, offering assistance with moving in, and even brought over a plate of freshly baked cookies. It was a neighborly gesture, and I appreciated it. As the weeks went by, I started to notice peculiar things about Mr. Matheson. He had a habit of leaving his apartment late at night, always carrying a large duffel bag. Curiosity got the best of me, and one evening, I decided to follow him discreetly. He led me through the quiet streets, his pace quickening as he headed towards a secluded area on the outskirts of town. I watched from a distance as he disappeared into a dense forest, duffel bag in tow. My heart raced with a mixture of fear and curiosity, and I hesitated about whether to approach the forest or head back home. In the end, my curiosity won, and I ventured into the woods. The eerie silence was broken only by the rustling of leaves underfoot. As I walked deeper into the forest, I stumbled upon something that sent chills down my spine: a shallow grave. My heart pounded as I approached the grave, and dread washed over me when I saw what was inside. A lifeless body, wrapped in plastic, lay in the makeshift tomb. Panic set in as I realized that my seemingly friendly neighbor, Mr. Matheson, might be a serial killer. I couldn't stay there any longer, and I retreated from the scene, making my way back to the safety of my apartment. My mind raced with fear and uncertainty. I had to do something, but I couldn't go to the police without concrete evidence. Over the next few weeks, I became consumed by my own investigation. I started keeping a journal, documenting Mr. Matheson's strange behaviors and late-night excursions. I also reached out to some of my neighbors, subtly trying to learn if they had noticed anything unusual. One evening, as I watched from my window, I saw Mr. Matheson returning from another late-night trip to the forest. This time, he seemed agitated and nervous, constantly glancing over his shoulder. It was then that I noticed a smudge of fresh dirt on his clothing. I knew I had to act fast. I contacted the police, sharing all the information I had gathered. They arrived at Mr. Matheson's apartment the following day with a search warrant. Inside, they uncovered a horrifying collection of evidence: photographs of his victims, meticulously detailed journals chronicling his crimes, and chilling trophies taken from his victims. It turned out that Mr. Matheson had been a serial killer for years, operating under the radar in our quiet town. He was arrested, and as the details of his heinous crimes emerged, the community was left in shock. I had played a crucial role in bringing him to justice, but the ordeal had left me scarred. The friendly neighbor who had welcomed me with cookies had turned out to be a cold-blooded killer. As I moved away from that apartment building and the memories it held, I couldn't help but wonder how well we truly know our neighbors. The experience had taught me that evil could lurk in the most unexpected places, and it had left me forever haunted by the horrors I had uncovered living next door to a serial killer.
Story 3, The Troubled Soul Next Door. Moving into a cozy suburban neighborhood was supposed to be a dream come true, a fresh start in a peaceful community. My new apartment was nestled in a quiet complex, and everything seemed perfect. Little did I know that my neighbor, Mrs. Turner, would shatter that illusion with her eerie and disturbing behavior. At first glance, Mrs. Turner seemed like a harmless, middle-aged woman. She had long, disheveled hair and often wore tattered clothing. Her eyes, though, told a different story. piercing and vacant, as if they held a lifetime of sorrow and pain. The strange occurrences began almost immediately after I moved in. Mrs. Turner rarely left her apartment, and when she did, it was always during the dead of night. Her footsteps echoed in the hallway, disturbing my sleep, but the sleepless nights were just the beginning. One evening, as I returned home from work, I noticed a disturbing sight. Mrs. Turner stood outside her apartment door, whispering to herself. Her words were unintelligible, a string of gibberish that sent shivers down my spine. I tried to ignore it, convincing myself that she might have mental health issues that needed attention. Days turned into weeks, and her behavior grew more erratic. I would often hear her shouting and screaming late into the night. Her words were a jumbled mix of anger, sorrow, and despair. The other neighbors had grown equally concerned, but none of us knew what to do. One afternoon, while passing by her open door, I caught a glimpse of her apartment. It was a chaotic mess, with walls covered in scribbled drawings and torn pages from books strewn across the floor. The air reeked of an odd mixture of decay and something unidentifiable. I decided it was time to check on her. I knocked on her door, but there was no response. Cautiously, I pushed the door open. The sight that greeted me will forever haunt my nightmares. Mrs. Turner sat on the floor, surrounded by torn photographs and newspaper clippings. Her eyes were wide with a manic glint as she mumbled to herself. But what terrified me most was the collection of bizarre and grotesque sculptures she had created. They were made from twisted metal and animal bones, with an unsettling resemblance to human forms. I stepped back in horror and called the authorities, fearing for both her safety and mine. When they arrived, Mrs. Turner resisted their attempts to help her, screaming and lashing out in a fit of rage. They eventually managed to subdue her and took her away for a psychiatric evaluation. In the days that followed, the truth about Mrs. Turner's troubled past emerged. She had suffered from severe mental illness for years, and her condition had deteriorated to a point where she could no longer distinguish reality from delusion. Her sculptures, it turned out, were her way of coping with the darkness that consumed her mind. The apartment complex breathed a collective sigh of relief when Mrs. Turner was taken into care, but the experience left me deeply shaken. I had witnessed the horrors of a mind in torment, and it made me realize how important it is to be vigilant and compassionate towards those who might be silently suffering next door. As I settled back into my routine, I couldn't help but wonder what other hidden horrors might lurk behind the doors of seemingly ordinary neighbors. Mrs. Turner's story was a chilling reminder that appearances could be deceiving, and that empathy and understanding were sometimes the only things standing between a troubled soul and the abyss of despair.